Hello and welcome to Spaces for People, an introduction to low traffic neighbourhoods. It's part of our knowledge sharing event series for Spaces for People. It's part of a series of events, webinars and discussions that we're holding that are practically focused and full of examples from across Scotland and around the world, and mainly about how we're adapting to these new sort of challenging times and where we're all asked to maintain physical distance. So if you haven't done so already, do check out our Showcase website. We'll be uploading previous sessions. So we're loading a whole bunch more on Monday, that's showcase-sustrands.org.uk. We've also got communications guidance, design guidance, and our accessibility guidance that's been made it, but it's up there on our website, which you can refer to. We did an event a couple of weeks back, Access for All, so it can be which we referred to that, so worth checking out. Lastly, to note that this webinar will be recorded, so if you have to dip out for any reason, then you can always catch up later. So today we'll discuss low traffic neighbourhoods. What are they? What are their key characteristics? What needs to be taken into account when you're designing them? And how can they enable places that are safer, healthier, more comfortable to walk, wheel and cycle around? So I'm delighted to introduce Julia Forini, Head of Built Environment for Sustrands at our London office. So before we kind of start with your presentation, Julia, could you just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what your work with the boroughs have been like for the past few months around this work?
Yeah. Hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Julia. I work in the London office for Sustrans, and we've been working, I think, over the past I'd say 3 to 4 years. There's definitely been a shift in the work we've been doing away from like just purely route-based work towards a more place-based work, and a lot of that has been on kind of neighborhood-based projects, and an increasing amount of that was around low traffic neighborhoods. So we were kind of over the past few years, we've worked with a few local authorities, Lewisham, Bromley, and Ealing in particular, working on low traffic neighborhood designs. And over the past, I guess, 3 months, there's been a huge acceleration in the rate of delivery of low traffic neighborhoods, kind of people recognizing the urgent need to implement a lot of these schemes on the ground. And throughout the kind of COVID response period, we've been helping many more boroughs to deliver kind of emergency low traffic neighborhoods. And it's been really exciting just to see how quickly change can happen, quite radical change, if people kind of put their minds to it. And if there's that kind of political will, it's actually sort of quite easy to implement this kind of change more than some of the more, I guess, civils-based main corridor schemes. So today I'll do a quick overview of low traffic neighborhoods. I'm probably going to go through for about 20 minutes, and then we can have a sort of a long session for Q&A. This is broadly, I guess, it's pitched at quite a high level. It doesn't go into too much detail, but we can touch on that detail in the Q&A at the end. So low traffic neighborhoods. Yeah, sorry.
Just say before you start, Julie, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat and we can talk to them afterwards. I'll come off webcam so you can see Julie in more detail, and we'll see you just after your presentation. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks. So yeah, low traffic neighborhoods, they're not a new thing. They've existed for a long time, but there's an increasing recognition of how urgently they're needed, both in response to COVID, but also in response to many of the other emergencies that we face as a society, from the climate emergency to sort of transport poverty, social inequality, air quality, all these kind of emergencies, and their solution that addresses many of these concerns. This is one of the sort of earlier examples in London in the 1970s in Hackney, de Beauvoir, one of the more famous low traffic neighborhoods that was actually campaigned for in the 1970s. Largely by parents when they sort of saw the arrival of cars threatening the safety of their children. I saw a stat earlier on Twitter that said that 80% of children used to walk alone to school sort of in the 70s. And obviously the arrival of the motor vehicle in large volumes was a big threat to that, and it has been a huge threat to that. And so sort of local campaigners in the area were able to campaign for this low traffic neighborhood in Hackney. But even before that, I've heard rumors that there was some rat running horse and cart in Pompeii, so they had to put these filters up as early as quite a long time ago. But even today, I think there's subtly sort of well understood, I think, in a lot of sort of urban design projects, and it's always interesting to see kind of any kind of big development inherently is a low traffic neighborhood. When you look at it, they're not designed to accommodate through traffic. They're designed to maximize the place function of the environment. And so no one would kind of retrofit a rat run through their development, but obviously people don't necessarily see it that way when you're changing the fabric of their streets that they're used to. But I think, yeah, so they're not a huge solution, but they're obviously increasingly relevant. And part of this is the increase in motor traffic that we continue experiencing across the country and internationally as well. And increasingly, there's the number of people that drive not to signs, but they drive to their phone. So historically, this is an example from Richmond in South London, where historically someone traveling east to west through the area would have just kind of followed the main road. But now that if they're following based on their phone will just tell them turn right in 500 meters because it's 7 minutes quicker to kind of avoid the traffic, avoid a couple of signalized junctions and rejoin at the other end. So people will just turn into that road, and that road looks like that, which is obviously a residential street. There's a couple of schools on that street, and it's not an environment that's designed to accommodate heavy volumes or heavy vehicles. And obviously that brings road danger, it brings pollution, it brings congestion, and overall it removes space from people and sort of claims that space for cars. It was interesting, another sort of thing I saw on Twitter was the idea, there's a lot of criticism of low traffic neighborhood that they displace traffic onto major roads, and actually the kind of flipping the narrative around that the lack of a low traffic neighborhood displaces the main road traffic onto the residential streets, and that's definitely what we see in a lot of residential areas. So the kind of initial solution to this, which we see again in a lot of and you'll see in most of the cities where you live and work, is that people would just put a single modal filter. So where there's a rat run, so the example here on the slide, you see this is a signalized junction down at the bottom, and there's obviously a bit of a rat run that people can do to avoid that signalized junction, and people would just simply put a modal filter down and affect that and sort of prevent that rat run. But all that does is it displaces the issue onto the parallel residential street in blue. So we talk about a modal filter as a transport intervention. So it addresses a particular issue on one street, but it doesn't necessarily result in mode shift. It just displaces the traffic and the air pollution onto another street. It doesn't affect, it doesn't influence the choice of transport or of trip that someone is making. So the alternative approach is the low traffic neighborhood approach, which looks holistically at a whole neighborhood or a whole traffic cell, and it aims to keep all the traffic on the major roads, and it makes all the sort of inner roads within the area access only, so that driving becomes less convenient. And what that does as well, it creates this kind of cul-de-sac effect where all the streets become really, really quiet. And so people find it safer and more enjoyable to walk and cycle, which a lot of us have seen during lockdown. Simply the fact that there's much less traffic on the roads makes it a much more enjoyable environment for walking and cycling. And what you do with this, by making driving those short trips harder, what you get is that mode shift. So you generally do affect people's transport choices. So instead of having to drive all the way around their neighborhood to go and visit their friend, maybe they'll just go for that walk, or maybe instead of driving to go to the supermarket, they might walk there. And we talk about it as a public health tool because it's not just a transport decision, but the way we move really does have a huge impact on well-being, both personal well-being, but also the people around us. Got a quick video here that kind of shows some of the, I think it's quite a good video in showing how low traffic neighborhoods work. Don't know if you can, I'll turn the volume off because you don't really need the volume, but there's a kind of, it explains quite well what the low traffic neighborhood aims to achieve. So that kind of video gives a bit of the outline and the principles. So the idea is definitely that the traffic sort of stays around the outside of the area, and the only people that can travel through are people walking on cycling or using public transport like buses. But obviously everyone still has access to their private home. Everyone can still drive to everyone's home. It just becomes a little bit less convenient. And the impact and why we talk about it as a public health intervention is kind of summarized quite well in this slide, which shows the big maps in the middle show every blue dot is a home where the legal levels of air pollution were exceeded. And you can see that on the left in Waltham Forest, they used to be exceeded on quite a lot of roads, and on the right, after kind of the filtered neighborhoods have been implemented, you can see just how many streets the air quality has improved on how many streets. And even on the major roads, there's been a great reduction as people have decided to do some of those trips by walking and cycling. And on the right, you'll see some of the kind of the well-being benefits in terms of expected, increased life expectancy from reduced air pollution, more walking and cycling, and also just a reduction in vehicle volumes overall. The statistic on walking and cycling, when you first look at it, 32 minutes a week doesn't seem that much, but over the whole population of the borough, it's just a huge amount. You'll see the stat at the bottom. It's typically 250,000 people going at parkrun every week for 3 years, which is obviously a staggering sort of health and well-being benefit. The other consideration is obviously kind of community cohesion, and we all know how detrimental high traffic volumes are for that. So the research from Donald Appleyard in the 70s, again, just showing how when you reduce traffic volume, that can sort of bring communities together. And again, a lot of people who sort of campaign against low traffic neighborhoods claim that you're dividing local communities, when in reality, obviously, when you remove or when you reduce the traffic volumes, you bring people together, you create those opportunities for chance encounters that build community strength and community resilience and trust amongst neighbors. This is a picture of I think, kind of talking about COVID and the opportunity that provides in terms of giving people an insight into what reduced traffic volumes and speeds can have on people's well-being, and really showcasing how streets can serve more purposes than just moving cars through them. So you'll see on the left, this is a picture from Wandsworth, where obviously they sort of reclaimed a lot of the space for shops to sort of spill out. And on the right, you'll kind of see the neighborhoods, and we've all seen these kind of images and videos during lockdown, the streets all of a sudden becoming children's playgrounds and children's sort of play spaces and sort of centers of our social lives when we couldn't be indoors and socialize. So I think COVID really has given a glimpse into what a low traffic neighborhood can do to our streets. And I think that's really important to build that into the narrative when we're talking about the power of low traffic neighborhoods. Historically, it was always very difficult to get people to even imagine what it would be like to have a street with very little traffic. And now everyone has experienced this for the past few months and can really campaign quite heavily to have these benefits forever. And again, sort of COVID delivery and the message from the Department for Transport very clearly on emphasizing the need to sort of implement low traffic neighborhoods urgently as a way to enable those, particularly those that don't have a car, to move around safely and to prevent a car-based recovery, which would have huge detrimental impacts on well-being and on the economy. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the design considerations, and we've just produced a guide that's available on the website. There's a link there at the bottom, which you can go and sort of read through, and it outlines a lot of the design process, hopefully in some kind of quite easy to follow steps that I'm going to run through today. So the first step is street classification, which kind of you can do at a community level or also at a local authority level, and you kind of ask the question of what streets should have through traffic and which ones should become access only. So you can talk about it in terms of the place and movement function, but broadly, we accept that for the time being, traffic has to remain on some roads, but which ones should not be taking the brunt of that through traffic. As I say, you can do it with the local community or the councillors. It's really important to get buy-in on this essential step, because it's the one that then gets the greatest level of scrutiny once the scheme is on the ground and people sort of who are maybe on those roads that remain open to through traffic feel like they've been left out by the councillors or by the local authority. And I think it's really important to do that initial step at the start altogether, so you get that level of understanding with everyone, and the decision making is very clear on that. So this is some of the outputs you'll see on the left. This is a community. This was a session we ran with the local community with tracing paper, just identifying what streets are open through traffic and which ones shouldn't be. And on the right, you'll see an example of a project that we did in London, again, kind of classifying the streets. And the second step, once you've done this, is to identify the low traffic neighborhood boundaries. So that builds on the first stage, but you decide that some of those routes that you initially maybe thought needed to carry through traffic don't necessarily need to do so. This is probably the most important step in the design process, I would argue. There are some very important considerations, which again are available on the guide around the size of low traffic neighborhood cells. And we talk about this kind of 1 square kilometer as the ideal size. And that's because we think about a switch of those car trips to walking, and a 1 kilometer walk is achievable for most people. And it feels like it's enough of a distance that if you make driving a bit less convenient, people may choose to walk some of those trips. So you'll see here, these are some of the cells that we came up for a project in Islington. And the risk with getting that initial LTN size wrong is that if you have an area that is too small, driving will remain still quite convenient, and you won't really enable many streets to become safe for walking and cycling. So people will still choose to drive those short trips. On the other hand, the risk with a low traffic neighborhood that is too large is that all of a sudden you're expecting people to have to walk some of those longer trips, 2-3 kilometers, which realistically many people may not do, and they may still drive those trips, and all you're going to do is get displacement instead of the mode shift that you want. So that's kind of a rule of thumb, this 1 square kilometer that we talk about. And obviously it depends on local context, what's the street network, how does the community identify? You don't want to sort of have maybe a high street get lots more traffic if it divides potentially the community. Where are the local amenities? Where do people travel to and from? I'd say the last point is quite important, not to use political boundaries. These are quite arbitrary, and there have been instances of projects that just are at the borough boundary, and it means that one local authority acting before the other just displaces that issue onto the adjacent local authority, which is often quite disastrous. So I'd say definitely look at the street network, not at the political boundaries. The third step is low traffic neighborhood prioritization. So this is just the kind of things that you can do once you've identified these cells to decide where to start. And obviously, we have limited funding, so you've got to start somewhere, and there's a real risk that local authorities start where it's easiest. And while obviously there's a bit of logic to that in the sense of having a showcase to start with, then sort of build on, but actually we definitely recommend a data-led approach that looks at where is a low traffic neighborhood needed the most. So what are the areas that are most deprived? What are the areas that don't have a lot of green space, where maybe collisions are the highest, where there's low public transport accessibility? These kind of considerations, which can really drive a sort of a reasoned and balanced program. You'll see the picture on the right. This is Lambeth. They divided their whole borough in about, I think, 25 low traffic neighborhoods, and they've prioritized them here again with a sort of data-led approach to justify why we're starting in certain areas and not in others. And the fourth step is actually designing where, how does that low traffic neighborhood work? So what modal filters you put in, what kind of one-way systems you put in, what turns you ban. And these are kind of the sort of high level aims. So you can't have a direct, convenient route through for motor vehicles, but you must of course retain access to all properties by car. And the third point, which is quite important, is to maximize the creation of new public space. I think it's quite easy to just, for car driving, to dictate what the proposals of your low traffic neighborhood are, but I think it's really important to think about, as well as preventing through traffic from using the areas, where do we want to create street life? Where do we want to create that nice pocket of space, that nice pocket park? Where do we know that people will congregate and will want to sit and spend time together? And how do we ensure that those are part of the design? So some of the tools that we've got to our disposal, obviously the main one is the modal filter, which you see at the bottom with the 2 bollards. So this is obviously the main way to sort of ensure that traffic volumes reduce on that street. There are other solutions like the diagonal filter, which kind of makes it easier, particularly for refuse vehicles, because they don't have to U-turn, they can still sort of swing around. You can have obviously modal filters with planters. We've seen a lot of these kind of in response to COVID. This is one on a B road in Bethnal Green in Tower Hamlets. And this kind of shows the transformative potential of once you filter a street. So this is what the road was before the filtering. This is about maybe a month ago that this scheme was put in. So obviously very, very car dominated, very unpleasant environment, very unsafe, difficult to cross. And now that the filters have gone in, you can just see how transformative that experience is for the street. So you can see people sort of easily crossing the road, people spending time together. You can see kids playing football at the bottom of the road. Just a vastly improved sort of public space for people. This is when I was talking about kind of using bollards not just as a way to prevent traffic, but actually as a way to create space. This is in Neighbourhoods, which is the area that I talked about at the start, where instead of just having one set of bollards, they've split them and they've separated them a bit. So it's created this kind of four-way filter, which has created this huge area of public space free of cars, where people can sort of learn how to ride a bike, play football, whatever. And I think it's really important whenever you're proposing modal filters to think, how can we make sure that we create space with these proposals, not just that we're stopping cars, but we're actually creating valuable space for people. And this is a pocket park, again, that I talked about before. So obviously sort of quite significantly higher budget, but it really sort of brings the scheme to life and brings those benefits maybe to even sort of climate resilience, and you can have suds and seating and all those kind of nice things which make a scheme often successful. Other solutions, other tools that you've got are bus gates, obviously as a way to retain bus access through the area. So these are quite simple, they're camera enforced, and they're sort of quite widespread. I think this one is in Aberdeen actually. And similarly, you can have them on kind of more shopping streets. So for example, this picture here from Waltham Forest, there's still motor vehicle access by night, but not during the day. In terms of the design, we obviously always kind of recommend trying to do it with a local community. I know it's a bit harder during COVID, but it really helps kind of bring the scheme to life for people. It really makes them understand that what you're doing is you are making driving harder, and once they put that little Lego block on the map, they really think, right, how am I going to get to work? How am I going to drive to the supermarket? And it really brings it to life, because until then it's quite difficult to understand the implications for local residents. And this is kind of what an example that I think is useful way to sort of display the impact of low traffic neighborhoods. So this whole area bounded by the orange line is kind of the scheme boundary. And within this neighborhood, we've created these three sort of access only areas. So the shaded blue area shows how far people can drive. So you can drive into the neighborhood, you can access all those properties, but then what you have to do is you exit the same way you came in. So you can't travel straight through the neighborhood. So you'll see the bus gates in the middle, which sort of prevent those north-south through traffic. Similarly for the purple area, again, you just access it from the same road. So there's literally no benefit to driving through the neighborhood unless you want to start or end your trip in that area. So through traffic is completely eliminated. And similarly for the red area, again, you will only enter off that road if you want to visit someone, or if you want to pick someone up, or if that's where you live. So this obviously eliminates the potential for any through traffic from using that cell. And this kind of shows it in kind of visual format, the kind of movements that you're forcing people to take by car. So once you enter the cell from a boundary road, you have to kind of go back the same way you came. And similarly for the other movements, you're kind of pushed back the same way you came. That's kind of the design approach. What this does is it kind of, as well as removing the through traffic from the area and sort of pushing that onto the major roads, which usually bound a low traffic neighborhood, it also results in traffic evaporation. So there's this picture here on the map is again from that same scheme that I showed before, and it looks at kind of the additional journey time that people may have to do. So this is if someone lives in the local area and wants to drive to the local Tesco's, it's currently a 4-minute drive. With the scheme as currently proposed, it might take 6 to 10 minutes. So they may decide to walk that trip instead, because it's a 12-minute walk and they don't have to stop for parking, and they don't have to pay for parking. So some of those trips will start being walked or maybe cycled. It's a 3-minute cycle instead. And there's just some quotes that have from our schemes, which I think are quite telling. I sometimes walk and sometimes drive my children to school, but with the bus gates, it will just not make sense to drive there, as I have to go all the way around the neighborhood. So I will walk every day. And that's exactly the evaporation that makes this scheme work. And simply at the bottom, this is a complaint from an angry resident after a filtering scheme was put in. It used to take 3 minutes to drive there, now it takes 15, and may as well bloody walk, which is great because that's what we wanted them to do. A little bit more on impact. I don't have long to go, I'm conscious of time, but the evidence from Waltham Forest, which is the scheme that has the kind of the most data that's been collected, is that across the area they had a 15% traffic evaporation across the whole sort of filtered neighborhood, and within the low traffic neighborhood, so on those residential streets, there was a 56% reduction in traffic, so huge volumes less. On the boundary roads, there was a little bit of an increase. So obviously some of that through traffic that was previously cutting through the neighborhood is still, some of those people are still driving, they're just driving on the boundary roads. And the increases in traffic for that on the 3 boundary roads were 3%, 11%, and 28% in sort of shortly after the scheme was introduced. But the data now, 3 years on, shows that the traffic volumes have returned to what they originally were. So even that kind of behavior change has happened. And at no time was there a journey time impact, because another important thing is that once you've got that traffic on the major roads, you can all control how it flows. So you can control the signalized junctions. You've got fewer vehicles joining from the residential streets. So you've got a lot more control of it as the network. When traffic goes through the residential streets, you've got no idea of sort of controlling the release valves. So it kind of messes up all of your traffic controls. Air quality improvements across the scheme, including on the boundary roads. See, even on those roads where there's a bit more traffic, the air quality improved, and improved safety on all roads, including again those boundary roads. And the boundary roads are important. A low traffic neighborhood is fundamental, but we can't forget about the boundaries. The boundaries should not become places of community severance. So you really have to look at, can we improve crossings? Can we provide maybe some cycle infrastructure, some bus priority, which can enable some of that mode shift for those longer trips, if done right. Before I sort of wrap up, I want to really emphasize that an amazing design does not guarantee success. Design is a really small percentage of what a successful low traffic neighborhood needs. And I'm going to quickly touch on some of the other elements. One key thing is engagement, and change is really hard. And something like a low traffic neighborhood is really transformative for people, and it looks really daunting for residents, and there's going to be a lot of anger, and there's going to be a lot of frustration, and you really need to get that political buy-in at the start. And also, you want to engage the community because they have those kind of snippets of knowledge that are really important to make sure that you're addressing the right rat runs, that you're putting the filters in the right location, that you're not maybe having a filter that will just attract antisocial behavior, but you're having one in a place where it will be looked after by the community. And I think it's important to think about the sliding scale of community engagement. I think particularly under COVID, we can't have full co-design sessions, but we can still do letter drops, we can still do telephone banks, we can have online platforms, maybe do some social distanced walks. I think it's really important to not forget about it, because if we want change to stick, we have to bring people along with us. The second one is monitoring, and I think it's really important. You will get a lot of opposition, and the way to sort of bust those myths is with data. So collecting a lot of data. You'll see the picture here on the right is some telemetric data, which looks at quantifying the percentage of through traffic in the area. And there was a lot of criticism of the scheme before we collected this. And once this was collected, it was very clear that yes, the majority of traffic through the area is through traffic, and if you prevent that, traffic will reduce, because a lot of residents still said, oh, there's not that much through traffic here, it's all just local people that are driving to work, and that very clearly shows it isn't. I think it's important that, again, we don't just talk about it as transport data. I think a lot of the benefits of low traffic neighborhoods are public health. So look at air quality, look at kind of the perceived level of safety, look how far, how often can kids play in the street. That's a huge metric of success for a low traffic neighborhood. But also, how many neighbors do you know? How many neighbors have you spoken to? How often do you shop locally? Some of these more intangible metrics, I think, really show the value of low traffic neighborhoods. And lastly, I think behavior change is really important. I think you can kind of put all this infrastructure in and try to change behavior, but you need to enable the shift you want to take place. And so really working hard, particularly with faith groups, many people might not use their walk or cycle for a number of reasons. Really understanding those barriers and understanding what you can do to enable them. So working with faith groups, with schools, introducing adult cycle training, maybe some personalized travel planning or incentive schemes, and also working for businesses, for cargo bike deliveries to make sure they can still operate. And maybe they may even find that their deliveries are quicker once they start doing them by cargo bike than they were before, when their vans kept on getting stuck through traffic on those residential streets. I think it's also important to sort of integrate it with schools. I know there's a lot of focus on kind of school streets, which are a good start, but they only really work for 2 hours a day. And if they're really constrained to the area around the school, it might not necessarily lead to that mode shift that we want. So in our experience, having sort of school streets that are embedded within a low traffic neighborhood really enables that mode shift that we want. And then you can sort of complement it with some time closures so that those people that still drive to school aren't idling right outside the school gates. So I think looking at the two in conjunction is really, really important. And just in closing, I think it's really important to look at this period in time as quite a pivotal moment. How local authorities react is really going to shape mobility for the, Chris Boardman said, for the next decade. And that's quite next decade, but I think it's really, really important to look at that in that context. And there's a real risk that if local authorities don't act, and they don't act with ambition, people will default back to the car, and that will have huge consequences in terms of transport poverty, congestion, inequality, road danger, particularly for those that don't own a car and that will really be left out to sort of bear the brunt of the consequences. And low traffic neighborhoods, I guess, in terms of value for money, in a constrained funding scenario, they are the best way to minimize those short car trips, improve the safety, and really shape the way that people will move in our COVID recovery. And we can't really ignore that. I think there's kind of a mandate for us to act upon that. And we've got kind of the framework that enables us to do that with experimental traffic orders that mean that we can get stuff on the ground quite quickly and learn from our mistakes and trial things. So I would really urge you to kind of get your trials on the ground, as lots of local authorities have been doing, and then kind of learn as you go. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. That's brilliant. I'm turning on my camera now. Thank you so much. We'll go straight to questions. We've got a few. Do keep putting them in if you've got anything that kind of came up for you. So our first is about community engagement, I think, and actually really pertinent, because I know that they're locally in Edinburgh. There's a petition that's been started to be against the low traffic neighbourhood. So how do you convince local residents that low traffic neighbourhoods will be beneficial when they've been so used to being able to drive and park, particularly whenever they want? Any top tips?
Yeah, it's a really hard one. I think it's interesting. I think I've just gone through the motions with the scheme, particularly in Manchester, which has had a sort of quite substantial community pushback. I think the reality is, I think you really need to be quite clear in setting the expectations, particularly with the decision makers. You need to make it abundantly clear that they're going to get more pushback on this than they ever had in their whole life. And people will be resistant to change. You really you're asking them to change the way they move around, which, there's a lot of entitlement with driving. If you're like, you have the right to drive wherever you want. And I think really setting that expectation that you will get thousands of emails from your constituents against this is a really important place to start, that kind of level of honesty. But I think beyond that, it's about reminding people that there is usually a silent minority that wants this change, and building a narrative around, most local authorities have a policy around trying to reduce road danger, trying to improve air quality. Most have probably declared a climate emergency, and there's a real mandate for action that you can't really ignore. And once you set a sort of a program that looks and feels like it's set in best practice, and I think there's increasing evidence from other areas, both in the UK and beyond, that this kind of low traffic neighborhood approach is the best way to do this. We've tried speed humps, we've tried controlled parking zones, and all that happens is that people drive more and more, and air quality gets worse and worse, and fewer kids walk to school. So you have to try something different, and it takes political courage for sure. But the evidence shows that when this scheme goes in, the support for those politicians increases. People get re-elected with increased majorities, because once people see the transformative potential that this has on their streets, they want more of it. They don't want less of it.
And this next question kind of leads on from that. So I hear that community champions engage with communities benefiting from LTNs. When do you engage these champions in the design process, and how do you find them, and what do they do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we've got some great examples of kind of quite community-led schemes as well. I think, yeah, community champions are hugely important, particularly if they are kind of people who are willing to put, you know, their face and on the scheme and kind of, yeah, be kind of quite publicly supportive, particularly if they're kind of decision makers or politicians. I think more at the community level, there are often kind of neighborhood groups that have been started to, I guess, particularly on those streets that maybe suffer the most from rat running. Maybe there's kind of local cycling campaigns or living streets groups that have been have emerged, where people will have quite a bit of literacy around the issue, or will have read quite a bit about it. Maybe some of the clean air parents groups that we've seen, particularly in London, are often kind of good community champions for schemes. And you really want to engage them from as early as you can. I think they've got multiple roles that they can play. They can definitely play a role in informing the design process. So I'd say really do try to engage them as soon as you can in getting some of those nuggets of knowledge from them, but also in building community support. And, you know, for every councillor that receives, you know, 10 complaints email, even if they receive 5 supportive email, that completely shifts their perspective. You know, they feel like they were doing the right thing. They feel they've got, you know, voters behind them. So really trying to build that community support, and not just have a quiet majority, a silent majority. Sorry, not just have a silent majority, but also have a vocal majority.
I suppose as well, communities are so, like you said, with them like working on like doing planting or there's lots of ways that people can take ownership of it as well when it starts to get on the ground. Okay, so next one is, how do you show the potential positive impact, economic impact of reducing the traffic through a high street? For example, moving bus routes out, taking incidental shoppers out, or relocating parking further from shop entrances. Is there data to show that they can thrive? I know that Sustrans has a lot of data around the pedestrian pound, and we can kind of point you to that. Anything you'd like to add on that, or any resources?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's obviously, data is kind of the way that you try to address that, and people will always tell you, well, that's data from somewhere else. I want data from my street where this has never been done before, which is quite challenging to collect. I would say that there's ample data, both from Sustrans, but also from, I think TfL has sort of a whole package of data about the economic benefits of walking and cycling. I think doing surveys is a really, really powerful way of doing this. So we often do sort of shopper surveys, and we go and we ask, you know, when people come out of the shop, how did you get here? And it always is the case that shop owners think that 80% of their customers come in a car, and invariably 20% of their shoppers come in a car. And really collecting that data to demonstrate that actually most of your shoppers are people who just walk by or take the bus by. And I think buses, I would be very, very reticent to removing bus routes. I think it's really important that we integrate them in a low traffic neighborhood. They're a key way to enable some of that mode shift. You know, lots of people will tell you, I can't walk or I can't cycle, and buses provide that great community resource, affordable community resource for those trips that can be done by bus instead of car. And we really need to integrate them in our low traffic neighborhoods.
So would you engage like bus company or like local transport like partnerships from the very beginning, but along with the community?
Yeah, I definitely think they're part of the solution, and particularly with kind of bus gates, which I showed in some of the designs. They tend to actually increase the level of service, because they obviously are not stuck behind queuing traffic. All of a sudden they've got kind of a clear route in front of them, and so you find they tend to be really supportive.
Yeah. So touched upon this briefly, but just as a design question. So how do low traffic neighbourhoods manage large vehicle turning movements if access is restricted, for example, bin lorries and other service vehicles?
Yeah, this is a really important one, and similarly linked to the emergency services as an ambulance goes by. There are 2 kind of key concerns that people, often objectors, raise. There's a few different things with this. So I think with large vehicles, definitely kind of how you design the neighborhood and where you put your filters to minimize those reversing distances. You really want to be mindful to, you know, maybe not create a really long, narrow cul-de-sac, which a refuse lorry is going to have to go all the way down. So I think you can be a bit smart with the location of your filters, maybe using some of those diagonal filters, which mean that vehicles don't need to U-turn. But in general, I've found that whenever I've engaged with kind of refuse collectors, they tend to think, they say that the most dangerous part for them is when there are narrow residential streets trying to stop at every door and they've got lots of traffic around them. Like that's what makes it really dangerous and scary for them. If you're on a narrow residential street and you're kind of weaving in and out of parked cars, with cars trying to overtake you, someone on the other side beeping, maybe a delivery van, and then you've got a kid crossing the road, that's where collisions happen. If you've got a really, really quiet cul-de-sac and you've got to reverse 50 meters, you're usually all right. So actually framing that conversation in terms of what's a safer environment for you. I know there's rightly a requirement to minimize reversing distances, but actually it's about the safety of a local environment. And when you've got really, really low traffic environments, and you talk about cul-de-sac, and they all pick up refuse, they all do their bin collections in cul-de-sacs, and they'll acknowledge the fact that it's really safe. The other point on emergency vehicles is really important. I think that emergency access is obviously essential, and they kind of are the ones that you're at their mercy. So I think really engaging them early and trying to understand what are the response routes that you need, and often they'll say, you can probably close a few of the streets off, but a couple of the routes you'll have to keep in. And whether you do that with, you can have a camera enforced closure, or you can have a collapsible bollard, but really engaging them quite early. And again, they tend to see their responses time improve if the streets are quieter, because an ambulance is more likely to get stuck in a quiet residential street than on a big road where they can just turn their siren on and use the opposite traffic lane. But in those residential streets, the cars just have nowhere to go. So if you free those residential streets, their response times can improve. But definitely early engagement with them is really important.
And again on design, so how does low traffic neighbourhoods fit in, or how does it fit in with the manual for streets or designing streets in Scotland?
Yeah, I think I think there are two pieces that are really aligned, but they're not necessarily immediately interlinked. I think the kind of they complement each other, but I think you can put a low traffic neighborhood in without necessarily moving many curb lines, and it will still lead to a lot of the kind of mode shift that you expect. But I think those kind of complementary measures can definitely increase, particularly the way that users will then use that space. So I think if you put a modal filter in, most people will still walk on the footway. If you put a modal filter in and all of a sudden you're changing the way a street looks and feels, you're adding sort of heating, greening, you're maybe like softening the curb and doing those kind of things that you really, all of a sudden you're having kids playing in the street, you're having, mobility scooters that are going down the middle of the road. So I think it kind of enables that second level. It is a lot more expensive, doing the civils works is probably 3-4 times the cost of the low traffic neighborhood. So obviously, particularly in the current funding climate, it's quite challenging, but it's definitely something I think I would strongly advocate having maybe 1 or 2 sort of key kind of showcase areas in a low traffic neighborhood where you do some of those civils works to supplement it, but you can't sort of do all your low traffic neighborhood with new curb lines and planting. It's really challenging.
So this one, I know a lot of the examples we have are within cities, but this question about rural context. So how would you tackle more rural areas where locals refuse to park anywhere that isn't directly outside the shop? Existing parking is limited and they feel greatly put out if they have to walk 100 metres. This is further frustrated by the majority of locals when surveyed, where showed that to people that just want to have the car, or showed that to be people that just want to have a car. Do you have any experience or any examples from like a rural context or maybe a smaller town?
I think kind of like market towns are obviously the kind of, I think the most obvious example. And I think kind of, you see so many market towns in the UK where the town square has become the town car park. And that's just accepted, and that's just the way that people see experience their streets. I think a really good place to start is with trials, maybe weekend trials on a Sunday, maybe have have a market instead of using it as a car park, and seeing, maybe have a sort of a town fair or an event that means that people will come, even if it means they have to walk 100 meters, and start slowly showing the potential. I think it's obviously a much harder piece because it sort of radically changes the way that people see space. But I think starting with sort of those community initiatives, those kind of local trials and big celebration events is a way to sort of start to get people to think about streets differently.
I think what we've seen recently is when people feel it, when people are in it, it sells itself almost, because you just see the benefits it can bring, or you see children, like you say, playing football. Or, how does the LTN approach apply to more recent residential developments that have few facilities, for example, like shops, within a walkable distance, so say in a half or a kilometre?
That's a very good point. I think it is definitely more challenging to have that mode shift if there are not many places that you need to get to within a short walk. And I think that kind of probably is a sign of, I guess, poor city planning or sort of land use planning. We hope that cities move more towards kind of the polycentric model, and I think the pandemic has really shown the value of having those community facilities and community amenities that you can just walk to. Maybe most people over the past 4 months have lived within their local neighborhood, and they've gone to that local shop that maybe they always avoided because it was a bit more expensive. But over the past 3 months, they've found themselves going there all the time. I think it is definitely a challenging one. I think it's one that maybe you'd have to do a little bit later in the process, and maybe you do look at some of those they need those supplementary measures. So when you've got that residential street and people can't really get to anywhere in very close proximity, how far are you from a bus service? How far are you from a segregated cycle route that people can maybe walk to the bus and then get that bus into town, or they can have that 2-minute cycle to get to the segregated cycle route that gets into the school or gets them to the kind of the local Tesco's or whatever. But I think really looking at kind of what are the trips that I'm trying to target? What is the mode shift that I'm trying to enable? And if it's slightly longer trips, then you probably need those complementary measures as well as just a low traffic neighborhood.
I think we might be frozen a little bit, but we can still hear you. That seems to be all the questions that we've had submitted. I don't know if there's anything you're back again. Anything specific that you think people should bear in mind, or any top tips? Because obviously, like you say, there's a lot of challenges, I think, sometimes with this, well, all the time with this. Anything you should really bear in mind, any maybe 5 messages that people think to take on board?
I would say definitely kind of look at the evidence. There's a lot of evidence. I've got some links here on this one. Definitely look at the evidence, kind of familiarize yourself with what's been done elsewhere. There's just lots of information available, and kind of building that literacy both amongst officers and amongst politicians to be able to comfortably talk about this is really important, because it gives them a solid backing. It doesn't feel like they're the only ones trying this. It feels like it's kind of a tried and tested method. So definitely kind of build that expertise. Another thing is, and I keep on banging on about it, but really kind of the political support, and really kind of emphasize that if every local authority has these grand aims and these big targets and big claims that they're going to achieve X percentage of whatever by which year, and really kind of almost put the business case together, like value for money, low traffic neighborhoods, like a filter is $2.5 grand. Like it's just unlike anything else. You can get 10 filters or 20 filters for the price of a zebra crossing, and just really putting it in those crude terms as really a way to demonstrate value for money, I think is really important. The third thing, really community engagement. And I think particularly if you're looking at kind of pop-up emergency interventions, which I strongly advocate, I think this is a time where we just cannot justify not acting, because the negative impact on that, particularly on the most vulnerable, and we've already seen COVID has disproportionately affected those that have suffered from kind of systemic injustices. We just cannot justify not acting. There's a really good quote from a guy called Chris Kenyon, who said that the failure to reallocate road space to walking and cycling now is equivalent to the failure to order sufficient PPE in February. And it really is that. You're putting people's lives at risk by not acting, and I think that's really paramount. And then the fourth thing is trials, and really using the power of trials. And you'll always get people asking, what does the model say? What do we expect is going to happen? And we're blessed with this wonderful implementation mechanism of just put stuff on the ground, trial it, and then you can tweak it, you can change it and see what happens. And once people see the change, that silent minority will really come out and support. And I've never in my whole life seen a local campaign to remove a modal filter that's been in for 10 years. You know, people will campaign against a modal filter that was put a year ago or 6 months ago, but people will just adapt and they will hate any suggestion of removing them. So that to me really, really gives that mandate of people want these things.
Thank you for that. I've totally put you on the spot there. So we've got one more question. How do you find out the split between through traffic and traffic that needs to be within the selected area?
Yeah, it's not a silly question. It's a good question. There's a couple of ways to do this. So one that is kind of the most robust way of doing it is doing an origin and destination survey, which you can do with automatic number plate recognition cameras. So you define your cordon, so you define kind of your area, and then you record any vehicle going in. So you record the number plates of all the vehicles going in and out. And if they kind of go in and out within, say, 10 minutes, that's obviously a through trip. So you log it as a through trip. If they go in and they don't come out within, half an hour, then it's probably a local trip. So that's one way of doing it. It's quite expensive, but it gives you a really, really strong data set to start and also to understand how vehicles move through that space. The alternative, which is what we used on those examples that I showed, is telemetric data. So this is mobile phone data that's collected over the course of whenever. Basically, anyone who has a mobile phone or has kind of an insurance black box, they can collect that data and they can again kind of quantify how much, and they look at when vehicles stop and they turn their engine off. So it's a little bit less reliable because you might have a through trip. You might have some of the local trips that don't. For example, a school trip, they might not turn their car off. They might just sit there idling, and then they're classified as a through trip when in reality they're a local trip. So it's a little bit less reliable, but particularly if you're looking at larger areas, it's probably good value for money. There was an example from Hackney. I think Hackney did a borough-wide survey, and they showed that 60% of the traffic through the whole borough is through traffic.
Wow. There's been a few cases where the emergency services object to modal filters and contraflows. Have you had the situation, and what was the outcome?
Yeah, there's been a few cases where the emergency service, definitely rings true. Even now in London, there's a few controversial issues at the moment. I think I'd say early engagement, like really trying to, at the start, just saying, look, this is the kind of approach we're implementing. What are the kind of high level concerns that you have? Is there anything that we can do to mitigate these? I think trying to get them to speak with other local authorities where some of the things have been implemented. So for example, going back to Waltham Forest, they've got a lot of data on their response time, for example, for ambulances, and it really shows that it's benefited from the scheme. So it gives them that reassurance. Because obviously, it's scary. Like the last thing you want is for an ambulance to be stuck, unable to get somewhere, and for there to be a casualty. That's obviously something that no one wants. So I think the early engagement, showing them precedence and getting to speak to people like them, someone who runs the local fire brigade, someone who runs the local police department, as a way to sort of talk through that. And then the last thing is being reasonable and making design adjustments. There's always little fixes that you can make, and sometimes they are a bit of a compromise, but I think we have to be clear that their needs are paramount, and it's all right sometimes. So we've seen some scheme in London now where instead of bollards, they're putting in cameras as a way to sort of restrict some traffic. And it's not ideal, obviously a bollard, you can let a kid play next to a bollard. You don't let a kid play next to a camera because a lunatic could drive through and run them over, which is obviously, not great, but in the grand scheme of things, you'd rather have a scheme that makes sure that emergency vehicles can access rather than one that risks that kind of really, really bad incident, which could tarnish low traffic neighborhoods forever.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the end of our questions, and it very conveniently almost at time. So thank you so much for your for doing this today. It's been brilliant, and we'll share your links, and we'll share we'll share them in the kind of follow-up kind of newsletter that we'll do to people after this. But also I think it'd be good to maybe, we had talked before COVID about doing like a workshop day of like chatting about how this could work and we design exercises and things. It's a bit more interactive than this, where we can't see you, you're just a black box, the audience there. So yeah, I think we'll look at doing that in the near future when we're kind of a little bit starting to get back into normality. But thank you so much for your time, Jill, and thank you all for attending today. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.